It wasn't snow falling on Nocturne anymore. It was a burial, a slow, suffocating descent of white, a silent storm swallowing the streets like a mass grave closing over the city. For 3 days, the blizzard had scraped skin from steel, blurred neon into ghosts, and silenced even the whir of surveillance drones. The world was still breathing, technically, but everything that made a human had long since frozen over. On the edge of District 9, where industrial lights stuttered in and out of existence and the wind carried the wails of empty machines, a lone figure staggered through waist-deep drifts. Her bare feet left no prints. The storm devoured them too quickly. Her body trembled beneath a patchwork of thin fabrics, wrapped more in desperation than insulation. Her skin was green, tinged blue by the cold, and along her arms the ridged markings of her species had faded beneath frostbite. She had once walked through embassies, not gutters. She had spoken 13 human dialects and brokered peace between 4 warring moons. Her voice had once quieted entire councils, but tonight it barely formed words. She turned into a side alley, led more by instinct than intention. The wind howled past the skeletal remains of a billboard that once advertised off-world transport. Now it blinked dimly, frozen solid. Promising escape is possible to no one at all. She collapsed to her knees near a steaming grate, the only breath of warmth for kilometers. Her lungs burned. Her legs no longer listened to her. And her pride, once tall as the towers above, was long since dead. The mechanic's shop stood above her. She didn't know who lived inside, didn't care. Just another human. Another sealed door. Another possible fire she could offer herself to. She pressed her hand against the icy metal of the back door and whispered, voice hoarse, barely audible over the storm. I offer my body, please, anything. Just let me in. Nothing. No lights. No movement. The door didn't open. She let her forehead fall against the cold steel. How many times had she spoken those words now? 10? 100? It didn't matter anymore. They all responded the same way, with silence, or worse, laughter. The first time she'd made the offer, it had almost killed her. It had been within days of her exile. Fresh off the shuttle that dropped her here like refuse, she'd approached a border guard, thinking she could bargain for shelter. Her species wasn't known for physical affection. Intimacy, for them, was sacred, ritualistic, controlled. She'd been taught never to touch without consent, never to bare skin without purpose. Offering herself had been a betrayal of every tenet of her culture. She remembered how his eyes lit up, not with sympathy but appetite. He'd agreed, for a night, then thrown her into the street with bruises and a broken rib. Her people found out. They didn't even hold a trial. She was a translator, a voice of peace, an emblem of unity between species. Diplomats weren't supposed to sell themselves to humans for survival. She was stripped of title, cast from the consulate, and marked with a digital exile seal only visible under scanners. To humans, she was nothing. To her own kind, she was worse, an abomination. She tried to crawl closer to the vent, skin already stinging with a dangerous numbness. The warmth it breathed was barely more than the ghost of a fire. But even ghosts were company in Nocturne. Then the door opened behind her. A figure stepped out. She didn't see his face. Her vision blurred, lashes coated in frost. But boots crunched beside her head, and a thick gloved hand touched her shoulder. Not rough, not grabbing, just assessing. She stirred, lips chapped and shaking. I'll do anything, anything. Please, just let me stay. I'll offer my body. I swear. I'll make it worth it. I can still. The man said nothing. He simply crouched beside her. She expected the weight of hands, the rip of cloth, the usual ritual of unwanted mercy. Instead, she was lifted, carried, not dragged, not hauled by the wrist like trash. He scooped her up the way one might a broken machine, gently, but with firm resolve. His coat smelled of metal and heat and old oil. She pressed her face into it without meaning to. Inside, it was warm, painfully so. The sudden shift in temperature made her cry out softly as her body tried to remember what not freezing felt like. He He laid her on a low cot in the corner of the room. The blanket he wrapped around her was heavy, scratchy, but it was the most sacred thing she'd felt in months. A heat lamp clicked on above her head, humming low. The blizzard's howl dulled behind reinforced steel walls. She trembled violently, curling into the blanket, unsure if she was crying or just thawing. Across the room, the man turned back to a small stove. He moved without hurry, as if this wasn't the first time he'd brought something broken in from the snow. He poured something thick and steaming into a bowl and returned to her side. His hair was black with streaks of gray, disheveled, falling into tired eyes that said more than his mouth ever would. His skin was rough, tan, with small flecks of old burns on his forearms. Grease stained his sleeves, and a thin scar ran just below his right eye. On his wrist, just peeking out beneath his sleeve, was a broken military chronometer, cracked, long dead, but clearly still warm by choice. He held the bowl out to her. Soup. She stared at it like it was poisoned. Why? She rasped. He tilted his head slightly. Because you looked cold. That was it. No conditions. No price. No attempt to clarify her earlier offer. Just soup, and a chair across the room, and a man who didn't seem to care whether she stayed or left. She took the bowl with trembling hands. The heat stung her palms. Her lip quivered, but she forced herself to drink. The broth was simple, salty, warm. It tasted like being alive. He returned to his workbench, the soft clinking of tools the only sound. He didn't speak again, didn't ask her name, didn't press her for details. That made him more dangerous than anyone else she'd met. I meant what I said, she whispered, almost too quietly. He glanced at her over his shoulder. I know. Then why didn't you? He turned back to his tools, wiping grease from his circuit board. Didn't want to. That made even less sense. She watched him from the cot, eyes narrowing despite the exhaustion weighing her down. His silence wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind either. It was unbothered, uninvested, but not uncaring. That scared her more than violence ever had. She shifted under the blanket, clutching the bowl close. Her voice broke as she spoke again, soft, barely audible. Severa. He looked up. My name. It's Severa. He nodded once. Darren. For a long moment, they just sat there in the dim light and soft hum of heat. And in that small, rusted room tucked inside a city that devoured the weak, two strangers breathed the same air, one still thawing, the other long frozen. She didn't understand him. She didn't trust him. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was dying. And that terrified her most of all. The storm had calmed by morning, but Nocturne never truly thawed. The snow had stopped falling, but it left behind a silence thick as metal. The world outside the mechanic's workshop looked the same as it had the night before, lifeless, gray, and cold in a way that went beyond temperature. Inside, the warmth still lingered. Not just the physical kind that came from the low hum of the heat lamps or the hiss of the floor vents, but a quieter warmth, a presence, a breath shared. Severa hadn't moved much during the night. Sleep came in fits, shallow and unrestful. Her body ached, her skin sensitive from the thaw, and every sound jolted her back to the surface. But for once, she hadn't woken to danger. No hands grabbing at her, no kicked out door. Just a faint clatter of tools, a rhythmic motion, steady as breathing. Darren was already up, his sleeves rolled back, grease smudging his forearms. He sat at his workbench, examining a busted circuit array with the quiet focus of someone who'd done this every day for years. He hadn't said anything when she woke, just glanced over to make sure she was still breathing, then went back to his work. She sat up slowly, the blanket still draped over her shoulders like armor. Her limbs were stiff, but no longer numb. She watched him for a while, unsure whether to speak. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, just fragile, like glass not yet broken. It struck her how ordinary he looked. Human, weather-worn, tired, not young but not old. A bit of stubble lined his jaw. His black hair was flecked with gray at the temples. That broken military chronometer was still strapped to his wrist, and he never glanced at it. Maybe he couldn't bear to. Maybe it was just a habit. He looked up briefly, then gestured with his chin toward the kitchen area. Soup's still warm. She blinked, the words taking a second to land. You left it for me? You didn't finish last night, he said, returning to the circuit. Didn't think it was right to toss it. No one had spoken to her like that in years. As if her presence wasn't a burden to be tolerated, but something that simply existed alongside his. Not pitted, not needed, just allowed. She rose slowly, blanket still around her, and made her way to the stove. The bowl was right where he'd said it would be, still warm. She picked it up with both hands and took a sip. The silence stretched on again, but now it felt gentler, like the quiet after a scream. What's this place? She asked finally. Workshop. Heating systems, mostly. Power grid converters, if someone's desperate. He looked up. Used to work for the city. Went private after the last riot. She nodded slowly. And you live here? It's warm, he said simply. Warm. That word kept circling back to her, again and again. Warmth. Not just heat, but the sensation of being held. Cared for. Given space. She glanced around. The place was cramped, cluttered. Every surface was covered in wires, old tools, boxes of worn components. A heater whined softly in the corner. There were no windows, just reinforced panels of industrial steel, but the light inside was soft, a faded yellow that made everything seem smaller and quieter. She couldn't help asking, "Why did you help me?" He didn't answer right away, just kept working, fingers tightening a bolt with practiced ease. You looked like you were about to die, he said finally. That never stopped anyone else. Darren paused, his hand frozen over the circuit. No, he said after a moment. It wouldn't. His tone wasn't cruel, just matter of fact, as if he'd learned that same truth a long time ago. Severa lowered herself into a nearby chair. Her body still ached. She wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the years leading up to it. He didn't ask for her story, but she found herself giving it anyway, in pieces. Words falling out of her like a leak she could no longer plug. I was a translator, she said. Not just a language specialist. Cultural liaison. I negotiated human Volari treaties. Stood in front of planetary councils. I kept wars from starting. That's who I was. Darren didn't interrupt. 3 years ago, she continued, I was assigned to the Terran Volari consulate on Mars' upper orbit station. The food shortage crisis was about to erupt into violence. I had clearance, resources, full diplomatic protection. Her fingers clenched around the bowl. I broke protocol. I offered myself to a human official to secure an emergency shipment. He was stalling aid for leverage. I panicked. Thought I could fix things later. She laughed dry and hollow. They found out. My own people. Didn't matter that the aid got through. Didn't matter that lives were saved. I had violated Volari's sacred principles. Debased myself with a human. I was stripped of all titles, declared ritually unclean. Exiled. She looked up at him. You see me now. This is what's left. He didn't say anything. Not right away. Just finished tightening the final bolt and set the tool down. A lot of people end up here, he said finally. Not because they're weak. Just because the system's built to break anyone who stumbles. She studied him carefully. You speak like someone who knows that firsthand. Darren gave a small shrug. I've seen enough to know mercy doesn't come from the top. It comes from the ones just trying to keep their heads down. He turned slightly, lifting his arm to scratch at his wrist, just enough for the broken chronometer to catch the light again. Military? She asked softly. Used to be, he said. What happened? Got tired of killing people I didn't hate. That was all. No dramatic pause. No elaboration. Just that. Severa didn't ask more. Something in his tone said she wouldn't get answers anyway. Not yet. They sat like that for a while. Two strangers in a cluttered workshop, sharing silence that no longer felt sharp. Eventually, he stood, walked to a small supply cabinet, and pulled out another blanket. He handed it to her without a word, then paused, as if deciding whether or not to say something more. You can stay for now, he said, until you're steady. Then what? She asked. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. When he turned away, she looked down at the blanket in her lap. Her fingers traced its edge, rough and worn, but real. She didn't know what tomorrow would look like. She didn't know if this man would change or if the storm would return. But tonight, she had a blanket, a chair, soup that hadn't been thrown at her feet, and someone who looked her in the eye without asking for anything. Maybe that was enough for now. But somewhere, beneath the blanket, beneath her scarred skin and frostbitten body, something long buried shifted. A flicker, a memory of what it felt like to want more than survival, to want to be human again. And though she didn't trust him yet, and didn't understand his kindness, Severa found herself saying something that surprised even her. "Thank you." Darren didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders tense just slightly. That was enough. Nocturne didn't know what sunlight looked like anymore. Its days bled into its nights in shades of silver and gray, broken only by the flicker of neon and the pulse of surveillance drones. Outside, the frost ruled everything, clinging to rooftops, crawling across steel, swallowing the weak. But inside Darren's workshop, warmth lingered. And for Severa, that in itself still felt unreal. It had been 2 days since he brought her in. She hadn't asked to stay, and he hadn't asked her to leave. They shared space like two strangers on the same lifeboat, quietly, without question. And in that silence, something unspoken began to stretch and settle between them. Not comfort, not yet, but familiarity, a rhythm. Each morning, Darren repaired machines. Old heating cores, broken grid converters, sometimes scraps from the scavengers in the lower sectors. He worked with quiet precision, moving like a man who didn't need to think about what came next, his body remembering what his mind didn't say. Severa watched him, studied him the way she used to study languages, looking for patterns, for meaning tucked inside motion. She offered to help once, awkwardly, unsure if she'd be in the way. He'd handed her a rusted panel without a word. That was the first time she felt it, trust, not granted but shared. Now, she sat across from him, hands covered in grease, her fingers clumsy but improving. Darren didn't correct her unless she asked. When she stripped a bolt or reconnected a wire backwards, he simply pointed it out, then kept going. No sighs, no condescension, just quiet instruction. She hadn't realized how starved she was for patience. Today, a storm was rolling back in. They could hear it growling behind the thick walls, testing the seams with icy breath. Darren had turned up the heat, but Severa still kept the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her skin, even in the warmer corners of the shop, remembered the cold too well. "You ever fix something too broken to matter?" she asked, eyes fixed on a dented power conduit in her lap. Darren didn't look up. "All the time. And you fix it anyway." He adjusted a set of wires with a small grunt. "Sometimes just knowing it can work again is enough." She nodded, her thoughts drifting somewhere else. Her hands, though, kept working. A sharp crack snapped through the silence. The power strip beside her sparked violently. She flinched, dropping the tool. Electricity buzzed through the air before the breaker tripped, plunging the workbench into a sudden shadow. Darren was on his feet instantly, crossing to her side. "You okay?" "I'm fine," she said quickly, pulling her hand back. "It just surprised me." He checked the panel, then the wires, then her arm. No burns, no serious damage. She didn't realize she was trembling until he placed a hand on her wrist. Just a touch, brief, but steady. "You're all right," he said quietly. Their eyes met in the dim light, and for a moment, she couldn't look away. There was something in his gaze, not pity, not interest, just attention. He saw her, not the stain of her exile, not the green of her skin, not the scars half hidden under her sleeves. Just her, and it was almost too much. "I can handle a little jolt," she said, forcing a smile. "I've been through worse." "I know." He turned to reset the breaker. The lights flickered back on, softer than before. The storm outside howled louder now, as if irritated by the sudden brightness within. Severa exhaled slowly and returned to her seat, feeling her pulse still dancing in her throat. It wasn't just the spark that had rattled her. It was how he'd touched her without hesitation. No demand, no implication, just a hand, warm, grounding. Later that evening, while Darren cooked something over the small stove, Severa sat near the vent with her knees pulled to her chest. She watched the steam rise from the pot, catching hints of something familiar. Herbs, maybe. Protein powder. A broth thickened with starch cubes. "It's strange," she said, "how a place can be this dead outside and still feel alive in here." Darren glanced at her, spoon in hand. You've been in worse places. She nodded. Doesn't mean this one's not still cruel. You planning to leave? I don't know. A pause. Would you stop me if I tried? No, he said, stirring the pot. But I'd tell you not to go at night. Especially not now. She studied him carefully, trying to read the rest of what he wasn't saying. You don't talk much, she said. Not really. No need to, he replied. Silence is not always empty. That's something my mother used to say. He gave a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. She was right. Severa looked down at her hands. The green hue of her skin had returned, richer now that the frostbite was healing. Her long crimson hair, once tangled and matted, had been cleaned, braided loosely over one shoulder. She was still a shadow of who she'd once been, but shadows at least had shape. Do you want to know what I did? She asked suddenly. What got me exiled? Darren didn't answer immediately. If you want to tell me, he said. But I don't need to know. That's the thing, she whispered. You should. She told him more this time, more than she had before. About the man who made her choose between dignity and saving lives. About the way her people valued image over outcome. About the tribunal that didn't even let her speak in her defense. She didn't cry. Not this time. But when she was finished, there was a quiet in her chest she hadn't felt before. He passed her a bowl of soup, sitting across from her on the floor. The knees almost touched. They were wrong, he said. Your people. That choice you made? That was courage. Severa looked up sharply. You don't even know me. I know you gave something sacred to save people. And I know that kind of courage costs everything. She stared at him, not because of what he said, but because he meant it. He hadn't flinched, hadn't judged, hadn't questioned her value after hearing her worst mistake. She reached for the bowl, her fingers brushing his. Not an accident this time. He didn't pull away. For a breathless second, their hands stayed there, connected, still. Then the power flickered again. The wind outside slammed against the workshop walls hard enough to rattle the ceiling. Darren stood. Generator's acting up again, he said. I'll have to check the outer unit. You're going out now. If the backup fails in a storm this strong, we'll lose heat. Severa hesitated. Then I'm coming with you. No, you're still. I'm not weak. And you said yourself, I'm learning. Her voice was steady. Let me help. He met her gaze. There was something quiet and unreadable behind his eyes. Then, finally, he gave a single nod. They suited up quickly. Layers of thick fabric, insulated boots, breathing masks. The cold would cut through anything less. Darren handed her a headlamp and a small toolkit. No wasted words. Just trust. When they stepped outside, the storm slammed into them like a wall. Severa had never felt anything like it. The cold didn't just sting, it invaded. It crept through seams and fabric and bone. But she kept moving, kept close behind him. The vents outside were half buried, the generator unit barely visible beneath a layer of ice. They worked fast. Darren knelt, checking the connectors. Severa held the light, handed him the right tools when he asked. Her fingers were stiff, but she didn't let them shake. Then, in the middle of it all, she glanced up, and for a moment the wind died. She saw him through the haze, crouched in the snow, headlamp illuminating the steam curling from the vent. The same man who had carried her inside without asking for anything. The same man who didn't care what she'd done. And something in her chest shifted again. Not warmth this time. Heat. Raw. Real. Alive. They finished the repair and got back inside, just as the cold sank its claws deeper into the district. Darren kicked the door shut behind them and peeled off his gloves, his breath misting in the air. You did good, he said, catching her gaze. Severa swallowed, still catching hers. Thank you for trusting me. He nodded once, then turned toward the kitchen, removing his coat. She didn't move. Instead, she stepped forward. He turned back toward her, and in the silence between them, something unspoken ignited. She kissed him, not desperately, not as a plea, soft, deliberate, full of everything she hadn't said. Darren didn't move at first, but he didn't pull away. When he kissed her back, it wasn't rough or fast. It was careful, like someone holding something fragile, like someone who understood what it meant to be broken and still choose to reach out anyway. When they finally pulled apart, neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. The warmth wasn't just inside the workshop anymore. It was in them. The kiss lingered long after it ended. Not on Severa's lips, not even in her body, but somewhere deeper. In a part of her that had been numb for so long, she'd almost forgotten what it was like to feel without fear. It hadn't been passion that ignited it. Not lust. Something quieter, more dangerous. Trust. That was the scariest part. Trust meant risk. It meant lowering defenses, loosening the grip on survival instincts, inviting a storm to come in unguarded. But Darren hadn't demanded anything, hadn't used the moment or her vulnerability. When she had pulled away, breath trembling, he had only looked at her, eyes dark and unreadable, and stepped back to give her space. They didn't talk about it. Not that night. Not the next day either. But the silence between them was no longer empty. It was warm, full of small things. A glance held too long. The way his shoulder brushed hers when they moved past each other in the cramped workshop. How she found herself making extra soup and pretending it was just to use up the last of the broth. Neither of them had ever been good at talking, and that hadn't changed. What changed was what didn't need to be said anymore. By the third day, Severa found herself humming. It wasn't intentional. The melody slipped out while she was calibrating a regulator valve, low and meandering. A lullaby from her childhood, full of minor notes and strange pauses. When she realized she was doing it, she stopped immediately. But Darren didn't comment. He just listened, then handed her a replacement coil. Later, he taught her a card game. She had no idea what the rules were, and halfway through, she realized he'd made half of them up just to see if she'd notice. When she caught him cheating, he didn't even deny it, just smirked and said, "You let me." That night, the generator held steady, the storm outside weakening into a distant whine. For once, they weren't huddled in coats and layers. The air inside the shop was finally comfortable. Severa stood near the stove, her arms bare, the green of her skin glowing soft in the golden light. Her long crimson hair, no longer matted or tangled, was tied loosely behind her, falling over one shoulder in lazy waves. Darren sat nearby, oil-streaked hands resting on his knees. The broken chronometer on his wrist caught the light with each movement. She watched him in silence for a moment, trying to decide if she had the courage to ask the question that had been growing in her chest for days. "Do you miss her?" she asked finally. Darren looked up, caught off guard. Whoever gave you that watch?" His eyes dropped to his wrist. He didn't answer right away. Then, without looking at her, he said, "My wife." Severa felt something tighten in her stomach. Not jealousy. Not really. Just the ache of distance between two people sharing space, but separated by ghosts. "She died?" she asked gently. He nodded. First major riot. Power station exploded. She was working in one of the upper zones. Didn't even find enough to bury. Severa stepped closer, the blanket around her shoulders shifting as she moved. "I'm sorry." She was strong. Smarter than me. Braver, too. She used to fix engines while I complained about the cold. Severa smiled faintly. "Sounds like someone I would have liked." "She would have liked you," he said, finally looking up. She hated the way the city treated outsiders. Got her into trouble more than once. A silence stretched between them again, but this one felt different, heavier, more fragile. "You're not betraying her," Severa said, barely more than a whisper. He blinked at her. "For caring about someone new," she added. "You're not replacing her. Some people, some losses stay with us. They're supposed to, but they don't have to be the only thing we carry." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. And when she stepped closer and knelt beside him, he didn't move away. She reached for his hand. His fingers were rough, calloused, burned in places where plasma had kissed skin. But he didn't flinch when she touched him. He let her hold it, their hands resting between them like a bridge. "Tell me to stop," she said. He didn't, so she leaned in. This time, it wasn't a kiss like before. It was slower, deeper. It unfolded like something earned, like two people finally letting the weight fall off their shoulders. Darren's hand moved to her waist, uncertain but sure. She kissed him again, and he pulled her gently into his lap, arms wrapping around her, as if afraid she might still vanish. They didn't rush. They weren't desperate. There was no bargain to be made, No need to perform. Only the soft hush of breath, the quiet flicker of heat between bodies that had known too much cold. Her markings lit faintly along her back, bioluminescent lines reacting to skin-on-skin contact. Valari touch bonds were sacred, private, and Severa had never allowed herself to form one since her exile. Not with anyone, but as Darren kissed her shoulder, tracing one glowing line with a fingertip, her body didn't resist. It accepted, welcomed, and it terrified her, not because it felt wrong, because it didn't. Afterward, they lay in silence, her head resting against his chest, the broken watch pressing lightly against her collarbone. The workshop felt quieter than usual, as if even the machines had stopped to give them space. "You'll leave one day," he said softly. She looked up at him. "Why would I? You're not meant to stay here. This city kills people like you." "I've already died once," she said. "And if I have to choose where to come back to life, I want it to be here. With you." He closed his eyes briefly, as if the words hurt more than comforted him. But he didn't argue. Instead, he pulled her closer, their bodies tangled beneath the blanket, two warm hearts in the middle of a world that had long forgotten how to care. In Nocturne, love wasn't something spoken. It was something built, quietly, patiently, like rewiring a dead machine and praying it would hum again. And between Severa and Darren, something had started to hum. Not loudly, not yet, but it was real. The storm had passed, but the cold never really left Nocturne. It just hid beneath the steel, waited in the corners, whispered through broken vents and half-shuttered alleys. Inside Darren's workshop, the air was warm, but Severa felt a new kind of chill. Not in her bones, but in the silence that fell when she opened the encrypted message terminal. It had been buried under layers of dust and disuse, tucked in the back corner of Darren's supply shelf. She hadn't meant to find it. She was looking for replacement coils for the heating array when she brushed her hand across the old relay box, still blinking with a dull, pulsing light. It shouldn't have been active. When she tapped the screen, the message bloomed into view, blunt, unadorned, unmistakably real. Subject: Severa. Violation 18B. Exile zone breach. Human asylum detected. Surveillance flagged. Action pending. Allies, 0. Current status, traitor. Her breath caught in her throat. It was recent, within the last 2 days. They knew she was here. She stared at the message, heart thundering in her chest, every instinct screaming to run. But her legs didn't move. Her eyes flicked to the corners of the screen. No visible origin, no signature. But the style, the code, the phrasing, it was Valari. Official. They tracked her through atmospheric signatures or heat trails, maybe a drone scan, maybe the bioluminescent marks she couldn't fully turn off. She'd stayed too long in one place. Let herself relax. Get warm. Get close. She turned when she heard Darren's footsteps behind her. He stopped in the doorway, arms folded, a faint frown on his face. He said nothing, just looked at her. "You knew?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "No," he said, stepping closer. "But I suspected something was coming. You should have told me." He walked over slowly and stood beside her. His eyes scanned the screen once, then again, jaw tightening. "They found me," she said, numb. "I don't know how, but they found me." Darren exhaled through his nose, not quite a sigh, but close. He didn't speak right away. Then he asked, "When they send these kinds of messages, do they follow through?" She looked down. "Always." He nodded once, then turned to the shelf behind her and pulled out a small black case. When he opened it, she saw a pistol, clean, matte steel, worn but well-maintained. Beside it sat a short-range jammer. "You had this ready?" she asked, stunned. "I don't take chances." "You were going to run?" "No," he said. "I was going to protect you." Something caught in her throat. She reached for the counter to steady herself. "Darren," she started, but the words stopped. She hadn't expected this. Not the message, not the weapon, and certainly not the way he looked at her, like none of it changed anything. He held her gaze. "I knew what you were when I saw you glowing under my lamp that first night. I didn't care then. I don't care now. But if they come, they will come," he said. "You don't need to convince me, but you also don't need to leave. I'll put you in danger." I chose to be in danger the moment I carried you inside. There was again that calm, steady certainty. He didn't make speeches, didn't romanticize. He just acted like his choices were simple, natural, like standing between her and death was no heavier than fixing a broken valve. She wanted to say something, anything, to answer him, to hold that calm between them. But the door sensor chimed. Darren froze. Severa's pulse spiked. A figure appeared on the outer camera. Not Valari, not armed, just a man in layered coats, face half wrapped in a thermal mask. Darren stepped to the door, checked the perimeter display, then opened it. The man stepped in fast, shaking off snow. His eyes scanned the room like he expected an ambush. Heat regulators out in Zone 3, he said. You're the only one who fixes those anymore. Darren narrowed his eyes. Zone 3's off-grid. No official power there. The man shrugged. People still need warmth. Darren turned to Severa. Her posture was rigid, every muscle tight. She could tell something wasn't right. This man wasn't afraid. He wasn't panicked like someone freezing to death. He was watching, reading, assessing. What's your name? She asked. He looked at her. Didn't say. That was all the answer she needed. Darren didn't move for a moment. Then, calmly, he said Severa. Toolkit. She moved fast, instinct overriding fear. She handed him the old case of tools, but Darren didn't reach for the jammer. Not yet. They walked into the back room, Darren leading the stranger, Severa a few steps behind. The stranger kept glancing at her, something calculating in his gaze. Never seen one of your kind that close before, the man said. Severa stayed quiet. I heard your kind don't break, he added, like a joke. She met his eyes. Only the ones who survive. That seemed to amuse him. Darren set the toolkit down, flipping open the lid, but his hand hovered near the weapon tucked just beneath the top tray. The moment stretched, long and taut. Then the stranger leaned in. Too close. I could sell your location, he said quietly, just for Severa to hear. Make good credits. You're worth a lot. Darren's hand moved fast. The pistol was up, aimed at the man's throat, all in one clean motion. You'll be worth less if you don't leave in 10 seconds, Darren said. The man didn't flinch, but he backed up, hands slightly raised. I was just testing, he said with a grin. No, Severa replied. You were hoping we'd hesitate. The man walked to the door, slow and smug. They'll come, he said before leaving. And when they do, that heat won't save you. Darren locked the door after him, then turned off the exterior sensors. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Severa said, I need to stop hiding. You're not ready to run. I'm not running. Her voice shook, but only slightly. I'm choosing, for the first time in years. Darren watched her for a beat longer, then nodded. Then we prepare. That night, she sat beside him while he rewired the drone alert system and upgraded the generator shielding. She didn't just watch, she helped. She tightened bolts, rerouted circuits, adjusted sensor calibrations. They weren't preparing to flee. They were preparing to fight. And somewhere between the sparks and wires, as snow returned to fall outside, Severa looked at Darren. His sleeves rolled, his brow furrowed in focus, and whispered something under her breath. Not a plea, not a prayer, a promise. I won't leave you behind. He didn't stop working, but his hand found hers, rough fingers curling around hers with quiet certainty. She was no longer a bargaining chip, no longer a broken exile begging at doors. She was standing in the center of a storm, and this time, she was choosing where to stand. They didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, though it certainly sat in the walls, pressed into every creak of steel and pulse of motion sensors, but because survival now demanded action, not rest. By morning, the entire workshop had changed. Not physically, not yet, but something beneath it had shifted. The walls felt sharper. The silence between Darren and Severa no longer carried the soft weight of intimacy. It was iron now, unspoken coordination between two people who understood that the time for quiet comfort had passed. Severa had only known exile until now, running, hiding, surviving. But this was something else. This was preparation. And for the first time, she wasn't being protected. She was part of the defense. Darren stood at the workbench with a disassembled plasma coil spread across the surface, wiring stripped and reorganized with surgical precision. Across from him, Severa knelt beside the floor vents, embedding heat sensors into the outer edges of the generator casing, her hands working fast but focused. "We only have a few hours before they move," she said without looking up. "They'll scout first," Darren replied. "Look for easy breach points. They'll try to isolate us. They won't expect resistance." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he slid a fusion battery into the rebuilt drone core, and the machine hummed to life, its eyes glowing faint amber. "No," he said finally. "They never do." There was something in his voice, not anger, not fear, but a knowing weight. The voice of someone who'd been underestimated before, who had survived because of it. "Darren," Severa said, brushing hair from her face. "How many times have you done this?" He glanced over. This kind of defense, planning for an attack." He hesitated, then said once. She frowned. "What happened?" "I lost." Severa didn't press. She didn't need to. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands never stopped moving. The past wasn't gone. It was embedded in every movement he made. They worked in silence for another hour. By midday, the vents were reinforced. The perimeter sensors were active. Darren had overclocked the drone system, sacrificing long-term stability for short-term aggression. Severa had helped rig a feedback trap in the entry hatch. One pulse would fry the neural implants of anyone trying to override the door manually. It wasn't much, but it was something, and they weren't alone. Sometime around second dusk, a knock rattled the outer door. Not a hard slam, not a security drone's system alert. A knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Darren froze. Severa grabbed the small plasma cutter beside her and stepped to the left of the doorframe, out of sight. Darren activated the outside camera. On the screen, a familiar figure stood waiting, tall, draped in environmental armor, but the faceplate retracted just enough to show sharp features and pale blue markings along the cheekbones. "Valari." Severa's throat closed for a second. "I know him," she said. "Envoy class. Diplomatic caste. He was on my tribunal. You want to talk to him?" "No." Darren studied her for a second, then opened the speaker channel. "You're outside my home," he said. "State your purpose." The envoy spoke calmly, with a voice that carried centuries of trained neutrality. "I'm not here to harm you. I came to speak with the exile." "She has a name," Darren replied. "Use it." A beat of silence. Then, "Severa." Even through the audio channel, the word carried weight, as if speaking her name cost him something. "I came to offer a compromise," he continued. "You leave with me, willingly, and this human stays untouched. His home, his systems, his record clean." Severa stepped forward, her voice steady. "And if I refuse?" The envoy's eyes didn't flicker. "Then he is complicit and subject to Valari sanction under Code 14A, harboring a traitor." She stared at the screen, and then she said it clearly for both of them. "Tell the High Council I'm not running anymore." The envoy blinked. Once, slowly. Then, with a voice sharp and cold, he replied, "Then this human dies with you." The screen cut. A moment later, the outer sensors lit red. Darren was already moving. They're jamming communications. Severa slammed the lockdown protocol and triggering manual breach. 3 minutes, Darren said. Maybe less. The wind outside screamed as if the storm itself had come back for blood. Inside, Darren shoved a weapon into her hand. Not the pistol, something heavier. A short-range arc emitter, calibrated for crowd suppression. She looked at him. "I've never fired one. You won't miss." When the outer wall cracked from the first charge blast, they both turned to face the door. Her pulse was steady. Not calm, not at peace, but focused. And then they came. Not an army. Just 4. Valari retrieval agents, masked in full tactical gear, stepped into the entry chamber, silent and coordinated. They didn't speak, didn't warn. They didn't expect resistance. The first one triggered the trap. A flash of white light burst from the doorframe, slamming the lead agent backward into the wall with a high-pitched crack. His body convulsed and dropped. The others moved in fast. Sever didn't think. She fired. The arc burst slammed into the second agent, flinging her sideways into the steel shelf. Darren tackled the third, driving a repulsor wrench into the agent's mask, breaking it with a sharp twist. The fourth swung a shock baton at Severa, missed, and caught the end of her arc blast to the chest. When it ended, the room stank of ozone and burned circuits. For bodies, all breathing, disabled, not dead. She turned to Darren. He was bleeding, shoulder wound, shallow but painful. "You're hit," she said, rushing to him. "I've had worse." She tore a strip from the emergency med kit and wrapped it quickly. Her fingers shook now, adrenaline fading. Her breath caught. But then, something unexpected happened. He smiled. "What?" she asked. "You called this home," he said quietly. "You said tell them I'm not running anymore." "Because I'm not," she said. "I've run enough." "You stayed and fought." She touched his chest. "So did you." He leaned his forehead against hers, their breath still ragged, hands locked together between them. Outside, the wind howled on, frustrated and cruel. But inside, beneath the flickering lights and smoke-stained air, two survivors stood over the wreckage of a life they refused to give up. They were no longer outcasts hiding from the world. They were a force rebuilding one. Together. It started with silence. Not the usual kind that filled Darren's workshop when the generators hummed or when Severa lost herself in the quiet of a shared meal. This was a colder, heavier silence. A silence that followed the clash. The resistance. The victory that didn't feel like one. The Valari retrieval team hadn't returned. Their bodies had been retrieved by drone, silently removed under the cover of night. No retaliation came. No follow-up message. No overt punishment. But that didn't mean they were safe. For the next 2 nights, Severa barely slept. Every flicker in the motion sensors tightened her chest. Every delay in the drone's scan pattern made Darren reach for the hidden panel beneath the bench. The air inside the shop felt different now. Not tense, not exactly, but weighted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. It was Severa who said it first. "We can't stay." Darren didn't argue. They were sitting by the vent, warm bowls of broth between them, their boots still dusted with frost from an early supply run. Outside, nocturne sky swirled with its usual ash-colored haze. Inside, their little corner of peace had become too loud with waiting. "I've seen this before," Darren said finally. "They go quiet so you let your guard down. Then they come back twice as hard." Severa stared into her bowl. Or worse, they let someone else do it. Someone without a badge or code to answer for. He didn't respond, but she didn't need him to. They both knew what came next. "They know who we are now," she said. "We won't survive the second knock." Darren set his bowl down. "So we go." The decision was made in that moment. Clean, wordless, mutual. But leaving wasn't as simple as walking away. They planned for 3 days. Darren pulled old maps from storage, routes the newer systems no longer tracked. Forgotten tunnels, inactive rail spines, collapsed comm towers that once serviced remote colonies. Severa repurposed drone parts into decoys, programmed to trigger sensors and scatter their heat signature. They burned old logs, scrubbed their IDs, disassembled the shop in pieces, leaving only what couldn't be traced. On the final night, Darren stood in the center of the now-empty workshop, the cot gone, the tools packed, the warm light extinguished. Only the soft blue of the emergency lamp remained, casting them in shadows. Severa stepped up beside him. "You built something real here." He gave her a faint smile. "We both did." Then they left Nocturne behind. The journey was long, harsh, beautiful in its desolation. They traveled by night, following the old lines north through the frost-bound wastes, sleeping in rusted outposts and the bellies of dead cargo trains. In the quiet moments between travel and rest, they didn't speak much, but their silences were full of understanding, of shared memory, of the kind of closeness that didn't require words anymore. Darren repaired their heaters with spare wiring and ingenuity. Severin navigated by old star maps and the flicker of planetary drift on her portable scanner. They moved like two parts of the same machine, imperfect but in sync. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually, they reached the edge of the world, a stretch of ice so vast and untouched. It looked like the sky had fallen and shattered. And in the middle of it, a shape. At first, Sever thought it was a mirage, but as they approached, the outline sharpened into something real. A structure, cold and massive, partially buried in the ice. An abandoned communications station. It loomed like a forgotten relic of another era. Cracked satellite dishes, frost-covered panels, rust creeping over reinforced glass. But beneath the decay, it still stood, still held its shape, still waited. Darren approached the door, pried it open with a hydraulic bar, and stepped inside. It smelled of dust and silence. The air was dry. The cold kept everything preserved in a tomb-like stillness. Most of the systems were dead, but not all. The emergency power cell flickered when Darren reset the relay. With a low groan, the base came alive. They didn't say a word. Not as Severa lit the old wall lamps with salvage power. Not as Darren tested the oxygen scrubbers. Not when they found a small room in the back, lined with bunk frames and deactivated consoles. This place hadn't been meant for them, but it would be. They spent the next days rebuilding it, cleaning, warming it piece by piece. Darren rigged a heat loop from the broken solar banks. Severa patched the cracks in the insulation. They found food stores still sealed, water recycled through frozen filtration tanks. No one came. No sensors triggered. No signals traced. They were alone, and for the first time in their lives, that wasn't a sentence. It was a salvation. One evening, Severa stood at the doorway of the station, staring out over the frozen plain. Wind danced over the ice, carrying nothing but the sound of a world left behind. Darren stepped beside her, arms crossed, coat zipped up to his chin. She didn't look at him, but her voice was soft. "Do you think they'll find us? If they do, they'll wish they hadn't," he said. She smiled faintly. "And if they don't, then we live." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heroic. It was just the truth. They had nothing left to prove. No revolutions to start. No justice to demand. Only a quiet life to make. Behind them, the station hummed with power. The stove clicked. The lights glowed. Severa reached for his hand. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Together, they stepped back inside. Into warmth, into stillness. Into something that, after all they'd lost, still dared to call itself home. The wind still howled over the ice fields, dragging its fingers across the steel bones of the abandoned comm station. But inside, there was warmth. Not the artificial kind that buzzed from struggling heaters or flickered through emergency lamps. This warmth had taken root, slowly, patiently, through time, through shared silence, through days stacked quietly on top of each other like folded blankets. Months had passed since Severa and Darren disappeared into the white. They had arrived at the edge of civilization in the most literal sense, where maps ended and the sky began to forget its own color. But to Severa, it hadn't felt like an ending. It had felt like release, like permission to stop looking over her shoulder. They had found the colony purely by accident. Or maybe the world was just small in the right ways. It was a scattered settlement, barely marked. A few modular units lashed together with repurposed shipping crates and buried under snow. No gate, no flags, no scanning systems, just people and smoke rising from chimneys made of pipe scrap. A mechanic had value anywhere, especially in places forgotten by law and ignored by government. Darren had stepped forward and said 4 words, "I fix what breaks." That was all it took. The leader, a wiry woman named Hessa with ice-scarred skin and a voice like broken radio static, had barely asked another question. "We got plenty of broken things," she'd said. "You'll eat well." No one asked where Severa was from, or what species she was, or why she stayed close to the man with rough hands and a quiet mouth. This far north, names mattered less than usefulness. And kindness, when it came, was quiet. They were given a small unit at the edge of the settlement. Just 2 rooms and a workshop no larger than a freight container. But to Severa, it felt palatial. She cleaned it slowly, methodically. She repaired what she could, replaced what she couldn't. She didn't try to make it perfect, just whole. Darren opened his shop 2 weeks later. It wasn't much, Just a table, a few benches, and a wall full of tools arranged in the kind of orderly chaos that only made sense to him. He fixed heaters, air filters, water pumps, even rewired the defunct satellite relay that brought low-band transmissions into the colony. His customers paid in food, scrap, labor, or sometimes just a nod of thanks. Severin never officially worked, but she was always there, passing tools, offering advice. She had a sharp eye for circuits and an almost intuitive grasp of machine languages, which surprised no one more than herself. Some days she would teach. A young girl named Ilra, whose parents ran the algae greenhouse, asked her about old Valari dialects. Sever didn't have any books to give her, only memory. So she spoke the words, slow and careful, until Ilra began to mimic them back. Once, Darren caught her writing on the wall of the workshop, tiny Valari script etched into the steel with a broken stylus. "What's that say?" he asked, squinting. Sever smiled faintly. "It's not a warning. It's a promise." "Of what?" "That I'll never forget what it cost to be here." There were no more threats. No more alerts from orbit. If the Valari were still looking for her, they had given up or grown tired of chasing a ghost across ice. But she didn't live in fear anymore. She didn't wait for the past to knock again. She built something. It was subtle at first, small routines. Breakfasts without words. Working side by side. Evenings by the window, wrapped in thick blankets, steam rising from chipped mugs. A life assembled from scraps, like everything else in the colony. One night, as snow swept over the frozen plain outside, Severus stood by the door, arms crossed, watching the wind blur the world to nothing. Darren was behind her, repairing a regulator valve for a neighbor's oxygen pump. He didn't look up, but he could feel her thinking. She turned to him. "Are you happy?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away, just wiped his hands on a rag and set the tool down. Then he looked at her, not through her, not past her, but right into her, as if she were the only thing that hadn't changed since the day the world froze. "I'm home," he said. That was enough. They didn't talk about what had come before. Not anymore. Nocturne, the workshop, the blood, and the snow. Those were memories, closed chapters in a book they no longer needed to read aloud. The silence they shared now was different. Not hollow, but whole. Like a language they had written together. A kind of understanding that didn't need words. Some nights, Severo would wake before dawn, sit near the stove, and just watch Darren sleep. His body curled under thick fabric, the broken watch still around his wrist. He had never fixed it. She once asked him why. "Because it stopped on the day everything changed," he had said. "If I fix it, I might forget." She had understood that more than anyone. One morning, she sat outside the workshop, alone, wrapped in layers against the cold. Snow drifted down slowly, soft as breath. The sky above was a pale, endless gray. Her fingers curled around a mug of warm broth. The colony around her stirred faintly. Early risers, maintenance drones, the hiss of hydraulics. Life in its simplest form. She closed her eyes, inhaled the air. It smelled like metal and fire and frost. But more than that, it smelled like peace. When Darren stepped out beside her, brushing snow from his shoulders, he didn't ask what she was thinking. He just handed her a new coil, half-built, unfinished. "Want to help me fix this?" he asked. Severo looked at it, then at him, and smiled. "Yes," she said. "Let's fix everything." And so they did. Not the galaxy. Not the systems that exiled her. Not the old wounds neither of them could completely forget. But this place, this life, this quiet, snowbound corner of the world. Here, in the silence, they built something that finally felt whole. Not perfect, just enough. Enough to call it living. Enough to call it love. Enough to call a home. The wind howled on. The snow fell. And they stayed. That night, the wind screamed louder than usual, shrieking against the relay station's walls like something wild and half-forgotten. Severus sat alone on the floor, wrapped in a worn thermal blanket, her knees drawn to her chest. Darren was asleep across the room, curled against the heating pipe he'd spent most of the day reinforcing. She stared at the small object in her hand for a long time. It was smooth, oval-shaped, no larger than her thumb. Gray-blue stone with a single crack running across its center. It looked like nothing to anyone else. something a child might skip across a frozen pond. But to Severa, it was the last thing she owned from her old life. The only thing they hadn't taken from her. The stone was called a vesicra in the old Valari tongue. It wasn't precious. It wasn't powerful. But it was personal, passed from one generation of women to the next. A tradition so old it no longer had a proper translation. The word roughly meant keeper or chosen one. It wasn't given lightly. It wasn't gifted in ceremony. It was offered quietly, intimately, by a Valari woman to the one she chose to bind her future to. Not as property, not as an act of submission, but as a claim of loyalty, of belonging. And Severa had never given it to anyone. She'd carried it in her uniform pocket when she was still an ambassador, tucked it into her boot lining during exile, kept it hidden even when she'd thought death might come for her in the gutters of Nocturne. And now, in the cold silence of a half-buried relay station, she held it in her hand, considering what it meant to offer it. Darren stirred in his sleep, turning over. The faint yellow glow of the heater cast his face in shadowed gold. There were lines on his face now, new ones from stress and pain and long days hunched over broken machines, but none of them hardened him. If anything, they made him more real, more hers. Severa stood slowly, her bare feet light against the cold floor. She approached him in the dark, heart thudding louder than the wind outside. When she knelt beside him, he opened his eyes just a little, not startled, just aware. She didn't speak at first, just reached out and gently took his hand. He looked at her, bleary and quiet, then noticed the object she was placing in his palm. He blinked once. "What is this?" he asked, voice husky from sleep. Her fingers closed around his. "In my culture," she said softly, "this is only given once. To one person." Darren sat up slightly, cradling the small stone like it might shatter in his grip. His brow furrowed as he turned it over in his hand, feeling its worn edges, the faint crack down the center. "They took everything from me," she said, her voice steady now. "My title, my home, my future. This is all I had left from that life." He looked at her, truly looked, eyes locked onto hers, every wall between them already gone. "You're giving it to me?" he asked. She nodded. In Valari tradition, this is how a woman chooses her mate. Quietly, not with vows or rings, but with this. His hand tightened gently around the stone. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she whispered, "but I want to." There was no grand declaration, no sudden kiss, just stillness. Darren leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers, just for a second. A grounding gesture, a silent agreement. Then he pulled her close, folding her into his arms as if she'd always belonged there. And for the first time in her life, Severa believed she did. Outside, the storm kept howling, relentless and hollow. But inside, in the shelter of a forgotten world, two people sat in silence, bound not by blood or name, but by choice. And in her culture, that was the only bond that ever truly mattered.